Welcome to Module 3. I hope you are enjoying the film club this week and that you have got your reading ready for the book club that will be happening very soon, kind of in conjunction with the next module. I encourage you to start thinking about the final project and start emailing me as you have questions about what to do for that, if you're on the right track. Remember that I'm very much happy to read your drafts in advance of turning in the final product. This week's module has to do with the themes of gender and sexuality. And the first thing that I feel like we need to do to kind of get ready to read the things this week is to really understand what do we mean when we're talking about gender and what do we really mean when we're talking about sexuality and some of the terminology that goes along with all of that. So that's what we're going to look at first in this video, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what the readings are and some suggestions for how to engage with those readings. Ordinarily in this course, we would have some readings that introduce these ideas. What is sex? What is gender? What is the difference? What are these binary constructions of gender and sex called? But we don't have time for that, so I'm going to give you a summary in case this is a new topic for you. For starters, sex is referring to the biological components that make us male or female. Those would be what the binary constructions of sex are called. But this is a little bit more complicated than what we would typically think, or that maybe our politicians would have us believe, because sex is made up of not only our physical body parts, the different anatomy that we have, but it also has to do with chromosomes, and it has to do with hormone production. And very often these things are not all working in conjunction to create what we think of as a pure male or a pure female. So this idea that these things are completely binary, that there is only male and only female, is just biologically not accurate. There are plenty of people who fall into a category that medically is called intersexed, where something among that anatomy, uh, the chromosomes, the genetics of it, the hormones, where some things are not all perfectly lined up, and it's way more people than we would ever imagine it to be. So I encourage you to look into what intersex means, and some of the resources that are available on that, if that's a term that is new to you, because I think that serves to complicate this very binary construction, that you're either male or either female. And gender is maybe even more complicated than that, because gender has to do with the things that culture layers onto male and female. What does it mean to be male within this culture? What does it mean to be female within this culture? And we call those constructions masculinity and femininity, right? So somebody is either male and masculine or female and feminine, but we know that increasingly with more visibility from people in the LGBTQ community, that those we can't live in a binary world. We don't live in a binary world, and so there isn't this just masculinity on one side and femininity on the other. And how do we complicate those ideas? And how do people who are coded female but embody more masculine characteristics, and vice versa? How do they live within our culture? And what kind of limits are placed on them within our schooling institutions? So, so that's what those constructions kind of mean. Sex, gender, that it's more complicated than the binary constructions of those things that are typically talked about. What are some other words that we need to understand before we can really delve into how gender comes into play in the school, in the classroom settings? One of those is the word feminism, right? Feminism is a much maligned word in popular culture very often. And there's a great piece by Bell Hooks. It's very short. I'll link to it in the discussion boards, that really explains what feminism is and what feminism isn't. Feminism basically is a movement for equality. It's a movement to make space for women and men and those in between to embody whatever performance of gender, whatever performance of sexuality is true to themselves, and that there should be no limits placed upon them, politically, legally, socially, culturally, by those institutions. So feminism within education is going to be calling on us as educators to make space in our classrooms for students to embody whatever gender performance is authentic to them, to make sure that no limits are being placed on children based on their gender performance, making sure that we are representing affirmatively students of all gender identities in our classrooms, and historical figures and scientists, etc., of all genders in our classrooms, so that our students all see themselves reflected in the curriculum that we are bringing to the classroom. Also, with regards to gender and gender performance in schools, something that often comes up is the idea of stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is not something that is only to do with gender. It is something that can also impact students with regards to race, ethnicity, exceptionality, all identities. But it's something that often gets talked about in relation to gender. So we have readings about stereotype threat in this unit that are going to help us unpack that a little bit more. The other half of this unit brings in LGBTQIA concepts and how those things interact with schooling. And very often I find that educators, particularly folks who work with elementary or younger kids, think that this has nothing to do with them, that they do not need to know anything about sexuality, sexual orientation, that will not enter their classrooms. It has nothing to do with anything. And it's my experience that, yeah, it still does. Because not only may you have children who are already beginning to identify as an LGBTQ person, because by the time we're in the 5th grade, we've got kids who are starting to go through puberty and are becoming aware of their own sexualities and their own sexual orientation. But you also increasingly have students who are questioning their gender performance. So we have students who are transitioning and coming out as trans, earlier than kindergarten. So these are things that are coming up and are applicable to you regardless of what age group that you are working with in teaching. But I understand that it's something that is uncomfortable for people, and it is something that is a politically hot button issue. It is also deeply rolled into religion, and I understand that. And so I know that having these conversations can be very uncomfortable and disconcerting for people, because a lot of times we're pushing up against deeply and authentically held religious beliefs that you have. But while it is possible for you to go teach somewhere, if you are somebody who does not like people of color, you can go teach somewhere where there aren't going to be any people of color. If you are somebody who doesn't particularly enjoy, working with women or men, you can probably go find an all girls or all boys school to go work in. If you are someone who just can't abide the notion of working with poor children, you can go work in a rich district. You cannot go anywhere that statistically you will not be working with children who identify as LGBTQ. Now, they may be hiding. They may not feel comfortable coming out. They may not be able to be their authentic selves in that space that's been created. But statistically, there is no way that you can go teach somewhere where you will not have children who are not straight cisgendered children. So I have some terminology that I want to go through. I feel very passionate about this. And we need to understand these words and these terms regardless of where we are going to go teach. And, feel the way that you feel about people who are LGBTQ. But we have to be able to create spaces in our classrooms that are safe and that do not unfairly limit the kind of educational experience that kids and their families, for that matter, who are LGBTQ have access to. So you've probably heard the term LGBTQ before, and a lot of people add other letters to the end. So you might also just see it represented as a plus sign, LGBTQ+. This is typically referring to folks who are not straight, not cisgendered, right? And there's a huge variety within that designation. So the L typically stands for lesbian, which typically refers to two women who are partnered or attracted to one another sexually, romantically. Gay is sort of an umbrella term, but also can be used to refer to two men who are attracted to each other sexually or romantically. Bisexual is someone who is attracted to both men and women. Transgender is a person whose biology, genetics, and gender performance and the way they feel about themselves and their gender identity, things don't all line up. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more specifically in a second. Q stands for either queer or questioning. Queer is a word that used to be a derogatory term and still, depending on how it's used, can be, but it's also a term that's been reclaimed and is widely used within the academy in particular to talk about people who are not straight. There's queer theory, there's people who study queering different spaces and institutions, and it's this idea of making room for more than these binary constructions. Intersex, I mentioned a little bit more earlier. Intersex is where the biology, the anatomy, and the hormones, all that physical stuff may not align along typical lines. Asexual is someone who is not sexually attracted to anyone. They may still be romantically attracted to people. They may still be partnered, but they don't have that physical drive for sexual action. Pansexual is a term that typically refers to someone who's attracted to all people, right? So whereas bisexual still has these notions of sex wrapped up into it in the sense of there's male and female, and I'm attracted to male and female. Pansexual is meaning that you can be male, you can be female, you could be genderqueer, you could be trans. It doesn't matter, right? They're attracted to all people regardless of gender identity, gender expression, sexuality. And genderqueer is a category that sort of refers to people who aren't going to box themselves into being masculine, feminine, male, female. They're living in these other sort of in-between spaces. Transgender and cisgender are two terms that are increasingly, with greater visibility, becoming, heard more and more often. And in North Carolina, in particular, with HB2, the bathroom bill, and all of that, these are things that are pertinent for us as educators because they impact our schooling spaces. So transgender is the term that refers to when our biological sex, so our body parts, hormones, genetics, all that physical stuff, and our gender, how we think and feel about ourselves, how we perform, what sex we are, male, female, etc., in the world. Things don't all align, right? So we may be transgendered. Cisgendered is where our biological sex, so our bodies, our hormones, our genetics, and our gender, how we think and feel about ourselves and how we perform our sex in the world, do align. So I like the genderbread person because the genderbread person sort of explains this idea of bodies, hearts, and minds. And that's how I talk to my 7-year-old about this. We talk about bodies, hearts, and minds. And if all those things line up, you're probably a cisgendered person. If things don't all line up, you're a transgendered person. And it breaks this down into the idea that our minds, that's our gender identity. We're, man, we're woman, or we're gender queer, we're somewhere in the middle. So it's using this idea of spectrums, right, to talk about this continuums. Then gender expression is our body, how we go about, putting out that gender identity, how we express that gender identity. Are we feminine? Do we express it in a more feminine way, in a more masculine way, in a more androgynous way? Then there's our body parts, right? Our biological sex, male, female, intersex. Then there's the idea of sexual orientation, our hearts, who we are attracted to, who we love. And, in that regard, you can be heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, fall somewhere on that spectrum. So there are a couple of other terms that I think we need before we can really delve into all of this stuff. And those have to do with the idea of homophobia or transphobia versus the idea of heteronormativity or cisnormativity. So this is the question to ask yourself, okay, while you're working through the readings on this idea this week. What is the difference between heteronormativity or cisnormativity and homophobia, transphobia, and how do they play out in school, right? So heteronormativity and homophobia are both referring to sexual orientation, right? And one is a little more overt than the other. Homophobia, right, is this sort of active hatred, fear of people who are not straight, right? And so, this tends to be the more aggressive of the two terms, whereas heteronormativity is perhaps even more insidious than it is aggressive, because it's all the little ways that we make it clear to even the youngest of children that being straight is the normal way to be. And we see this play out in representation, right? And how we talk about love and romance and family. And every fairy tale has a prince and a princess, right? And it's promoting this idea of love as being between a man and a woman. And we see that as fine, right? We see that as, totally normal and natural. We can have these kind of stories in our classrooms. But if you introduce a story book into a classroom that represents love between two princes or two princesses, all of a sudden that becomes a political statement and becomes about sex, right? Whereas, we could talk about Cinderella and Prince Charming. We never had to mention sex. We were talking about love, right? But for some reason, we get it kind of twisted up as soon as we introduce a same-sex couple, and people who are against that kind of representation in schools will say things like, well, if I have a book that has two princes in it, then suddenly I'm going to have to explain anal sex to 5-year-olds. And that's not true. You didn't have to explain heterosexual sex to 5-year-olds to have Cinderella and Prince Charming. So the same is true in the other case too. We get it all kind of twisted up in our heads as adults. Instead of talking about it and thinking about it as love and partnership, we think about it in these very kind of other ways, right? Transphobia, we see play out in the law and policy conversations right now. I mean, all around us at the moment. Who gets to use what bathroom? Who gets to use what locker facilities? Who gets to be safe in those spaces and who isn't? And how do we frame that conversation? And why is it being talked about in the ways that it's being talked about? So you have readings that are specifically discussing how homophobia and heteronormativity and how transphobia is impacting educational policy and practice, and how that is serving to limit children who pertain to these groups in school. These are a few other resources that you can click on if you want to learn a little bit more about the idea of heteronormativity. And I hope that you'll think through those questions as you tackle the readings for this week.